He didn't finish his paintings, never built his flying machines. And yet, 500 years later, we still call him a genius. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, not as history carved his name in stone, but as he truly lived, curious, unfinished, and quietly changing the world with every question he asked. And no, this isn't that movie where Drew Barrymore plays Cinderella and suddenly starts quoting Renaissance philosophy. Never made it, but if she had, Leonardo would have been the one writing her lines, because he was the kind of man who believed that to truly see a leaf, a shadow, or a smile was the highest form of wisdom. If you love stories that unfold like quiet dreams where art, science, and wonder walk hand in hand, then stay with me now. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that bell so you don't miss what comes next, and let this voice carry you gently into another time. So make yourself comfortable, let your body sink into stillness. Close your eyes if you wish, and breathe slowly, deeply, as we begin a journey through the life of a man who spent his days learning how to see. He was born not in a palace, but in a modest farmhouse nestled in the hills near the town of Vinci. No grand announcements marked his arrival. He was the son of a notary and a woman of unknown name, born out of wedlock, given no surname of his own. And yet, from the beginning, there was something different about him. Even as a child, he would stand for long minutes, watching a spider weave its web, or follow the path of an ant across the dirt, or stare at the way shadows moved across a wall as the sun shifted. He drew constantly, not on paper at first, but on scraps, on walls, on any surface he could find. His hand moved as if guided by something deeper than thought, sketching wings, hands, the curve of a river, the twist of a tree root. His father watched him with a mixture of pride and bewilderment, unsure what to do with a boy who cared so little for arithmetic or law, but who could capture the exact moment a bird folded its wings before landing. As he grew, his mind became a quiet storm of observation and inquiry. He noticed things others passed by, the way light reflects differently off wet stone than dry, how laughter changes the shape of a person's eyes, how water spirals when it flows around an obstacle. He filled notebooks with drawings and notes, written in his mirror script, as if to keep them secret even from himself. He studied anatomy by dissecting animals, then, later, human bodies in the dim candlelight of hospital morgues, tracing muscles and tendons with reverence as though uncovering sacred geometry. He designed machines that no one had ever seen, flying devices shaped like bats, war engines with rotating blades, bridges that could be folded and carried. None of them were built in his lifetime, yet they existed in his mind, in his sketches as possibilities, waiting for the future to catch up. But Leonardo was not driven by fame, nor by the need to complete. He was driven by wonder. Each painting, each drawing, each page of notes was not an end, but a step in an endless journey of seeing. When he painted The Last Supper, he did not merely depict a scene, he captured the exact moment the words, "One of you will betray me," hung in the air, freezing 12 faces in shock, denial, fear, sorrow. When he painted the Mona Lisa, he did not just render a portrait, he created a presence. A woman who seems to breathe, to think, to know something just beyond our reach. And when he stood at the edge of a cliff, watching swallows dive and turn in the wind, he wasn't just admiring nature, he was searching for the laws that made flight possible, sketching wing structures, calculating angles, dreaming of a day when humans might soar. Tonight, we will walk with him through the quiet corridors of his life. We'll sit with him in candlelit rooms, listening to the scratch of his pen. We'll follow him through the streets of Florence and Milan, where art and power intertwined. We'll stand beside him in moments of doubt, of loss, of silent triumph. We will see not the myth, but the man, the one who left thousands of pages unfinished, who questioned everything, who believed that to truly see was the highest form of love. This is not a story of perfection. It is a story of curiosity, of patience, of a mind so vast and gentle that it still echoes through time. And if you'd like to share where in time or space you're listening from, you're lying beneath a blanket in a quiet room, sitting by a window under the stars, or drifting between wakefulness and sleep, note that you are not alone. Thousands of others are here with you, letting this story carry them gently forward, just as the currents of the Arno once carried leaves toward the sea. So let your breath slow, let your thoughts soften. There is no rush, destination we must reach, Only this moment. Only this voice. Only the quiet company of a man who spent his life learning how to see. We'll begin at the very beginning, at the foot of a Tuscan hill, where a child kneels in the dirt, drawing the outline of a dragonfly's wing, unaware that one day the whole world would lean in to look at what he saw. Long before his hand ever trembled with charcoal over parchment, long before the first delicate curve of a wing or the intricate spiral of water caught in motion appeared beneath his fingers, there was only stillness, not an empty silence, but one full of breath, of presence, of unseen currents moving beneath the surface of things. This was Tuscany in the early 1450s, a land untouched by haste, where time did not rush forward but unfolded like the petals of a flower opening under the morning sun. The hills rolled softly into the distance, covered in vineyards trained along wooden stakes. Olive trees gnarled with age, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the breeze. Mist clung to the valleys at dawn, drifting between stone farmhouses and crumbling watchtowers left behind by forgotten lords, dissolving slowly as the light grew stronger. The air carried 1,000 subtle scents. Wild thyme crushed underfoot, damp clay after a brief summer rain, the faint sweetness of figs ripening on sun-warmed branches, always beneath it all, the dry, warm smell of earth baked by months of golden light and cooled each night by gentle winds from the Apennines. There were no engines, no distant hum of cities, no flicker of electric light, only the soft creak of wooden shutters opening, the low call of a cow in the meadow, the rustle of leaves as a breeze passed through the tall cypress trees standing like sentinels along the winding roads. People lived close to the ground here, their lives shaped by the rhythms of nature rather than the demands of clocks or calendars. They woke with the birds, stirred the embers in the hearth, and began their work while the stars still lingered in the western sky. A farmer walked behind his oxen, guiding the plow through dark soil, turning the earth as his father and grandfather had done before him, his boots leaving deep impressions that would soon vanish beneath the wind and rain. Women gathered herbs at the edge of the woods, their baskets filling with rosemary, sage, and fennel, their voices low as they spoke of children, of weather, of saints whose names were tied to the changing seasons. Children played barefoot on dirt paths, drawing shapes in the dust with sticks, chasing lizards between rocks, or lying on their backs in the grass, watching clouds drift like slow ships across the endless blue. There were no books in most homes, no maps, no printed words. Knowledge was passed down through touch and word, through stories told by candlelight, through songs sung while kneading bread or mending clothes. And though few could read, everyone knew how to listen to the wind, to animals, to the quiet voice within that warned of storms or guided them home through fog. It was a world where mystery was not feared, but accepted as part of life, where dreams were spoken of seriously, and omens were watched for in the flight of birds or the pattern of smoke rising from a chimney. In this world, far from the grand courts of Florence or the marble halls of Rome, nestled among rolling hills and narrow footpaths, lay the village of Anciano, a cluster of stone houses with red-tiled roofs, huddled together as if for warmth. A single church stood at its heart, small and unadorned, its bell calling people to prayer at dawn, noon, and dusk. Chickens scratched in the courtyard, goats bleated from wooden pens, and vines climbed the walls of cottages, heavy with grapes in late summer. Water came from a well shared by several families, drawn up in wooden buckets and carried carefully indoors. Inside these homes, the floors were of packed earth or rough-hewn stone, cool beneath bare feet. Walls were thick, built to keep out both heat and cold, lined with shelves holding clay jars of oil, wine, and dried beans. A single oil lamp burned at night, casting soft halos of light that danced on the ceiling, making shadows stretch and sway like silent companions. The nights were deep here, so dark that stars blazed with an intensity rarely seen today. So clear that the Milky Way appeared as a river of light pouring across the sky, reflected faintly in the still surface of a mountain spring. And in that darkness, people slept soundly, wrapped in wool blankets. Lulled by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl drifting from the forest beyond the fields, it was into this world in the spring of 1452 that a child was born, unremarkable at first glance, like any other infant wrapped in linen and laid near the fire. He arrived not in a palace, not in a city of scholars or artists, but in a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Anciano, part of the small territory governed by the town of Vinci. His mother's name was Caterina, a young woman of unknown origin, perhaps a peasant, perhaps the daughter of a local artisan. His father, Ser Piero, was a notary, a man of some standing who traveled frequently between villages to draw contracts, wills, and legal documents. But because the two were not married, the boy bore no family name of his own. Instead, he would be known simply as Leonardo da Ser Piero da Vinci Leonardo, son of Ser Piero, from the town of Vinci. No grand celebrations marked his arrival. No poets wrote verses in his honor. No astrologers studied the stars to predict his fate. He entered the world quietly, as if the universe itself wished to keep his coming a secret, as if it knew that this child would not announce himself with noise, but with observation, with patience, with a way of seeing that would one day change how humanity understood beauty, motion, and life itself. Even as a baby, those who cared for him noticed something different, not in his cries, nor in his movements, but in the way he watched. While other infants turned toward sound, this child seemed drawn to light, to patterns, to the play of shadow across a wall. He would lie still for long moments, his eyes wide, following the path of a fly as it crawled across the ceiling, or the way dust motes swirled in a beam of sunlight. As he grew, his curiosity deepened, not in sudden bursts, but in quiet, persistent waves. He did not run ahead of others. He lagged behind, crouching beside a puddle to watch how raindrops created rings that spread and vanished. He followed ants in long trails, tracing their journey from crack to crevice, wondering where they went, what they carried, how they knew the way. He stared at the veins in a leaf, comparing them to the lines on his own palm, sensing without words that something connected them. He listened to the wind not just as sound, but as movement, noticing how it bent the grass in waves, how it made the branches creak, how it carried the scent of distant rain before a storm arrived. No one taught him to see this way. It was simply how his mind worked, like a lens slowly focusing, capturing details others passed by without notice. His earliest days were spent in this house, surrounded by the rhythms of rural life. He helped gather firewood, fed the chickens, carried water from the well. But even in these simple tasks, his attention wandered toward the unseen. He watched how water spiraled when poured from a jug, how smoke twisted as it rose from the chimney, how the shadow of a tree stretched longer and thinner as the sun sank. When given a piece of chalk or a stick of charcoal, he did not write letters, he drew. A bird perched on a fence, a dog sleeping in the sun, the curve of a hill against the sky. His hand moved with a quiet certainty, as if translating what his eyes saw directly onto whatever surface he could find: dirt, wood, scraps of paper saved from his father's discarded documents. No, were no art lessons, no formal instruction. Only this inner drive to capture the world, not as a record, but as a question. What is this? How does it work? Why does it move like that? And so, in this unassuming corner of Italy, where the air smelled of herbs and sun-baked stone, where the nights were filled with the song of crickets and the soft glow of stars, a mind was awakening, not with fanfare, not with force, but with stillness, with depth, with a love for the invisible threads that connect all things. The Renaissance had not yet been named. Science and art still lived in separate worlds. The future was unwritten. But here, in this quiet home beneath a vast and star-filled sky, the first quiet breath of a new way of seeing had begun, gentle, patient, almost imperceptible, like the first trickle of water beneath a frozen stream, long before it breaks the surface and flows toward the sea. There were no monuments to mark this beginning, no crowds to witness it. Only a child kneeling in the dirt, drawing the outline of a dragonfly's wing, unaware that centuries later, the whole world would lean in to look at what he saw. The seasons turned slowly around him. Spring brought wildflowers blooming in the meadows, bees humming between blossoms, and the soft green of new leaves unfurling on ancient trees. Summer settled in with heat that shimmered above the fields, cicadas singing in the afternoon stillness, and long evenings when families sat outside, fanning themselves and speaking in low tones. Autumn painted the hills in gold and rust as grapes were harvested and olives pressed into oil that filled clay jugs stored in cool cellars. Winter came quietly, with frost on the stones at dawn and wood smoke curling from chimneys into pale gray skies. Through it all, the boy grew, not loudly, not boldly, but inwardly, his thoughts deepening, his gaze sharpening, his hands learning to translate what his eyes perceived into lines that held meaning. He began to notice things others missed, the exact moment a bird folded its wings before landing, the way light reflects differently off wet stone than dry, how laughter changes the shape of a person's eyes. These were not idle observations, they were acts of reverence, small prayers offered to the mystery of existence. No one called him a genius. No one whispered of greatness. To most, he was simply a quiet boy, thoughtful, perhaps too dreamy for his own good. His father, though proud of his intelligence, worried that such constant questioning might lead nowhere. "Hey, why must you always ask how?" he once said, watching the boy sketch the mechanism of a millstone turning. "Can you not just accept that it turns?" Leonardo could not. He needed to understand the why, the how, the hidden logic beneath the surface. And so, he returned again and again to the world around him, not to change it, not to master it, but to know it, to feel its pulse, to trace its patterns with his eyes and hands. In this, he was already becoming what he would remain for his entire life, not a man who sought answers, but one who cherished questions. There were no schools here, no libraries, no masters to guide him, yet every stone, every leaf, every drop of rain became his teacher. He learned balance from watching a heron stand motionless in a stream. He learned proportion from studying the symmetry of a butterfly's wings. He learned time from the slow arc of shadows across the courtyard floor. And when night fell, he would sometimes sit outside, looking up, tracing constellations with his finger, wondering if the stars moved in circles like the gears of a clock, or if they followed paths too complex for human minds to follow. He did not believe the heavens were fixed. He believed they, too, were alive, shifting, breathing, just like everything else. And in that belief, though he did not know it yet, he was already stepping beyond the boundaries of his time. The world around him was still bound by old ways, by tradition, by faith, by fear of the unknown. Most people believed the earth was the center of the universe. That illness came from imbalance or sin, that knowledge should not be questioned unless it came from scripture or ancient texts. But in this quiet farmhouse, a different kind of knowing was growing, one that asked not what was written, but what could be seen. One that trusted the eye more than the word. One that found wonder not in miracles, but in the ordinary miracle of a leaf, a ripple, a breath. And though no one recognized it then, this was the beginning of something new, not just for him, but for the world. For in this child's silent attention, in his endless curiosity, in his refusal to look away, the first fragile thread of the Renaissance was being spun, not in marble or paint, but in the quiet act of seeing. And as you listen now, resting in your own quiet space, perhaps you can feel that same stillness inside you, the part that notices the way light falls across your room, the rhythm of your breath, the quiet hum of the world outside your window. That part of you is not so different from him. It too knows how to wonder. It too knows how to see. You do not need to be famous. You do not need to change the world. You only need to pay attention to the way your hand feels against the blanket, to the sound of your own breathing, to the fleeting thought that passes like a bird across the sky. In that moment, you are no longer just listening to history. You are living it. Let us breathe slowly. Let the story continue. Even as a boy, Leonardo carried silence within him, not the absence of sound, but a deep listening, a kind of inner stillness that allowed the world to speak directly into his awareness, without distortion or distraction. While other children ran ahead, eager to reach some unseen finish line, he walked slowly, eyes lowered, not in shyness, but in focus, watching how water pooled in hoofprints after rain, how dust rose in spirals when a horse passed by, how shadows stretched across stone walls like living things breathing with the sun. There was no urgency in his movements, no need to prove himself, no desire to be first. He simply observed, absorbed, remembered, as if every detail, the curve of a leaf, the tremor of a spider web, the way light fractured on the surface of a puddle, was a letter and a message written just for him, one that would only make sense when all the pieces were gathered. and though he could not yet read the language of that message, he trusted it existed, and so he remained open. Patient, endlessly curious, like a traveler walking through a forest at dawn, not knowing the path but certain that each step was necessary. His early years in Anciano were marked by this gentle divergence, subtle separation not from people, but from the way they saw. To most, a bird in flight was just a bird, a fleeting shape against the sky, gone before you could blink. To Leonardo, it was a mystery written in motion, the angle of its wings, the way air caught beneath the feathers, the precise moment it tilted to turn, the rhythm of its breath hidden beneath layers of muscle and bone. He would sit for hours beneath an olive tree, its gnarled trunk shaped by centuries of wind and drought, sketching on scraps of parchment with a piece of charcoal held between fingers, already stained with ink from mornings spent grinding pigments in a broken bowl. His drawings were not perfect. They were not meant to be. They were questions made visible, attempts to capture not beauty alone, but truth, the hidden mechanics behind what the eye could see. A wing repeated 10 times, each version slightly different, as if he were chasing the exact curve that would unlock flight. A hand drawn over and over, not for elegance, but to understand how tendons pulled bone, how fingers curled around a stone, how life moved through flesh in silent, invisible currents. There were no classrooms here, no masters to guide him, no books filled with answers, only the land itself, vast and slow, teaching in whispers. The river taught him about currents and eddies, how water divided around a rock and rejoined downstream, carrying silt in delicate trails like memories trailing behind. The wind showed him how force could shape form, bending trees into permanent arcs, sculpting dunes from sand, carrying seeds across valleys without effort. The sun revealed how light fell differently at dawn than at midday, how it gilded edges and hollowed out shadows, how it turned ordinary things stone would skin into something luminous, almost sacred. He noticed things others passed by without thought, the way a spiderweb trembled when touched, how smoke from a fire twisted upward in slow corkscrews, how the surface of a pond reflected the sky not as a mirror, but as a trembling mosaic of broken light, shifting with every ripple. These were not idle curiosities. They were acts of devotion, small rituals of attention offered to a universe that seemed to whisper secrets to those who listened long enough, who stayed still long enough, who cared enough to look again and again. And then there were the books. Not many reached this quiet hillside, where knowledge traveled slowly, carried by merchants or clerics on dusty roads. But occasionally, through his father's work as a notary, a volume would arrive, leather-bound, heavy, smelling of candle wax and old paper. Its pages yellowed at the edges, its spine cracked from use. Leonardo would take it carefully, turning the leaves as though handling something sacred, afraid that too much pressure might crumble the fragile fibers. He could not read Latin well, but he studied the illustrations with reverence. Diagrams of gears, sketches of ancient machines, maps of lands he had never seen. Cities drawn with impossible symmetry, rivers flowing like veins across continents. One book, left behind after a legal matter, contained crude drawings of catapults and water wheels, their parts labeled in script he could barely decipher. He traced them with his finger, imagining how they might move, what forces they required, whether they could be improved, whether a man could ever build something that flew. That night he dreamed of mechanisms turning in the dark, of pulleys lifting stones into the sky, of wings unfolding like petals, of himself standing on a hilltop, arms outstretched, feeling the wind lift him gently, effortlessly, into the endless blue. It was clear to those around him that this boy was different, not strange, not unkind, but deeply inward, guided by a curiosity that refused to be satisfied by simple answers or accepted truths. His father, Signor Piero, watched him with growing fascination and quiet concern. He was proud of Leonardo's intelligence, proud that neighbors spoke of the boy's talent with a pencil, how he could draw a chicken so lifelike it seemed ready to peck at the page. But he also worried. In a world where men followed clear paths, lawyer, merchant, priest, farmer, what future was there for one who spent his days studying the veins of leaves or measuring the proportions of a frog's leg? "You must learn to finish what you start," he once said, holding a half-completed drawing of a mechanical cart, its wheels perfectly rendered, but the body only outlined. Leonardo only nodded, saying nothing. He did not believe in finishing. He believed in understanding. And understanding, he sensed even then, was not a destination, but a continuous unfolding, a process that demanded patience, repetition, revision. To stop before full comprehension was not completion, it was surrender. So, when the opportunity came to apprentice in Florence, it was not seen as a triumph, but as a necessary step away to give structure to a mind that wandered too freely, to place him under the guidance of a master who might shape his gifts into something practical, something useful. At 14, Leonardo left the hills of Vinci and traveled south toward the city that pulsed at the heart of Tuscany like a beating heart. Florence was not large by today's standards, but to him it was overwhelming. Towers rising against the sky, bridges arching over the Arno, the constant murmur of voices in piazzas, the scent of fresh bread mingling with iron, dye, wet stone, and animal hide. The streets were narrow, lined with workshops where hammer rang against metal, where pigments were ground by hand, where wood shavings curled from chisels like golden ribbons. Every building seemed to carry art upon its face, carved saints in niches, frescoes fading on outer walls, coats of arms etched into doorways. People moved with purpose, their faces marked by labor and ambition, their hands skilled from generations of craft. And above it all, the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore stood like a promise, a monument to human imagination made solid. It proof that even the sky could be challenged. He was taken in by the workshop of Andrea del Veracque, a master sculptor, painter, and goldsmith whose name carried weight in the city. Known not only for his skill, but for his discipline, his precision, his refusal to accept mediocrity. The studio was not a classroom, but a living space of creation, bright with northern light filtering through high windows, cluttered with tools, half-finished sculptures, rolls of canvas, jars of pigment labeled in careful script. Apprentices worked in silence or low conversation, their hands moving with practiced rhythm, shaping bronze, stretching frames, polishing marble. It was here that Leonardo would begin his formal training, not as an artist, not yet as an inventor, but as a maker, a doer, a student of materials. He would learn not just how to create, but how to distinguish the subtle difference between shadow and contour, between movement and stillness, between what something looked like and what it truly was. At first, he was given the simplest tasks: preparing panels, grinding colors, cleaning brushes. But he approached each with the same intensity he had once given to watching ants or clouds. He studied how lead white was made from vinegar and rust, how lapis lazuli was crushed into ultramarine, the most precious blue, worth more than gold. Learned the smell of linseed oil, the texture of gesso under sandpaper, the way gold leaf clung to prepared surfaces like sunlight trapped in thin sheets. He watched Verrocchio work the sureness of his hand, the way he stepped back often to study a piece from a distance. How he adjusted a line not because it was wrong, but because it felt untrue. And slowly Leonardo began to absorb not just technique, but philosophy, the idea that art was not decoration but revelation, a way of making visible the hidden order beneath the chaos of the world. But Leonardo did not only watch, he questioned, quietly, respectfully, but persistently. Why does this shadow fall here? How does the eye perceive depth? What makes one color feel warm and another cold? Verrocchio, a man of few words, at first seemed unmoved, yet over time he began to notice something unusual. This apprentice didn't just follow instructions, he improved them. When tasked with painting an angel's robe, Leonardo blended the colors so softly that the fabric seemed to breathe, the folds catching light as if woven from air. When asked to help cast a bronze sculpture, he suggested a change in the mold that prevented a flaw others had missed. And when, one day, he added a single figure to a group scene Verrocchio was completing, an angel holding a book, turned slightly, eyes alive with quiet knowing, the master paused, studied it, and said nothing. But from that day on, he gave Leonardo more responsibility, more trust, allowing him to work on commissions, to experiment, to explore. Yet even in this place of creation, Leonardo remained apart. He did not boast, did not compete, ate little, slept irregularly, often working late into the night by candlelight, his silhouette visible through the window as others rested. Hip notebooks, small, leather-bound volumes he carried everywhere, and filled them not with poetry or prayers, but with sketches. A bat's wing, a human skull, the flow of water around a rock, the muscles of a horse's leg. He wrote in mirror script from right to left as if to protect his thoughts, or perhaps because his left hand moved more naturally. No one understood why he did it. No one knew what to make of a young man who dissected animals to understand their muscles, who stared too long at people's faces, who would suddenly stop walking to measure the shadow of a tower with a stick. Still, something about him drew quiet admiration. Other apprentices watched him, not with envy, but with wonder. There was a depth to his presence, a calm intensity, as if he carried an entire world inside him, one he was slowly, patiently bringing into view. He did not seek fame. He did not crave approval. He simply wanted to know, to see clearly, to understand deeply, to capture not just how things looked, but how they were. And so, in that workshop, beneath the Florentine sky, surrounded by chisel and paint, fire and silence, the whispers grew louder, not from outside, but from within. The path was not marked. It had no name, but it was real, step by quiet step, sketch by careful sketch, question by unanswered question. Leonardo was beginning to walk it. Not toward glory, not toward legacy, but toward truth, toward a way of seeing that would, in time, change everything. He did not know it yet. He did not need to. For now, it was enough to listen, to hold a piece of charcoal, to let the world leave its trace on paper, one delicate line at a time. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel that same pull, the quiet urge to look closer, to ask gently, to stay with a thought a little longer than usual. You don't need to be called a genius. You don't need to change history. You only need to remain open to the way your breath slows, to the soft weight of the blanket, to the distant sound of the world outside, carrying its own quiet mysteries. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. There was no single moment when Leonardo became an artist. No sudden revelation beneath a cathedral dome or flash of inspiration in the silence of night that split his life in two. Before and after, his path did not unfold like a bolt of lightning, sharp and undeniable, but more like a stream finding its way through stone, gentle, persistent, almost imperceptible at first, yet carrying within it the quiet force of something inevitable, something that had been gathering long before he knew its name. Every step he took was small, deliberate, unremarkable to those who watched from afar, but each carried the weight of attention, of intention, a mind learning how to move through the world, not by following, but by seeing. He did not rush toward mastery. He did not announce his ambitions. Instead, he began simply, humbly, with his hands covered in dust from ground pigments, his fingers stained with ink, his eyes fixed on details others would never notice, as if the truth of things could only be reached through patience, through repetition, through the willingness to look again and again until something inside him shifted and said, "Now I see." In Veracqua's workshop, where the air was thick with the scent of linseed oil, hot metal, wet plaster, and beeswax, where sunlight fell in soft rectangles across wooden floors littered with shavings and scraps of cloth, Leonardo slowly earned trust not through pride, but through presence. While other apprentices sought praise, competed for attention, or rushed to finish their tasks so they might rest, he moved differently, lower, quieter, as though time itself had softened around him. When asked to prepare a wooden panel for painting, he did not merely sand and prime it. He studied the grain of the wood, feeling how it absorbed moisture, how it responded to pressure, how light traveled along its surface like water over stone. He noticed the tiny knots where branches had once grown, the subtle warping from years of dryness, the way the edge caught shadow just slightly darker than the center. When mixing colors, he recorded their ingredients in the margins of his notebook, testing how they changed under different light, how they aged over days, how ultramarine deepened at dusk, while vermilion seemed to glow from within. He treated every task, no matter how minor, as a door into a deeper truth, as if even the act of cleaning a brush could become a meditation on care, a lesson in what it meant to honor the tools that helped bring thought into form. It was during this time that he began to draw not just what he saw, but what he felt beneath the surface, not only the shape of a hand, but the story it carried. He sketched the hands of his fellow apprentices, not idealized, not heroic, but real, calloused, marked by labor. Veins rising like rivers beneath thin skin, nails cracked from hammering bronze, knuckles swollen from cold mornings. He drew faces in profile, capturing the subtle curve of a nose, the hollow beneath an eye, the way a person's expression shifted when lost in thought, how the corner of a mouth trembled just slightly before a smile appeared. He noticed how light fell across a shoulder, how shadow pooled in the folds of fabric, how a single line could suggest movement, breath, life. These were not yet masterpieces. They were not meant for display, nor for admiration. They were private inquiries, quiet conversations between his hand and the world, attempts to translate the invisibly motion, memory, into visible form, as if by drawing them, he might understand them, feel them more completely, carry them with him beyond the moment they occurred. One morning, Verrocchio assigned a group project, a painting of the baptism of Christ, a sacred scene to be placed in a chapel outside Florence, where farmers and shepherds would kneel in prayer, where candles would flicker against stone walls for generations. The master would paint the central figures, the young Jesus standing in the river, John the Baptist pouring water over his head, but the angels on the left were to be completed by his students. Leonardo was given one, a kneeling figure holding a red robe, turned slightly toward the viewer, eyes downcast, lips parted as if about to speak or sigh. To most, it was a supporting role, a background presence, a detail easily overlooked. But to Leonardo, it was a chance to listen to the fabric, to the gesture, to the silence between breaths, to the quiet sorrow that lives in the space between devotion and longing. He worked slowly, layering paint in thin glazes, allowing each coat to dry before applying the next, blending edges so softly that the transition from light to shadow seemed to breathe, as though the angel were not painted, but emerging from the panel itself. He painted the face with a tenderness rarely seen in religious art, not distant or divine, but present, aware, almost sorrowful. As if he knew what was to come, as if he carried the weight of all future sorrows in his stillness. The hair fell in delicate curls, each strand catching light like threads of gold spun from dawn. The hands resting gently on the robe were rendered with such precision that you could feel the warmth of the fabric, the slight pressure of fingers against cloth, the pulse hidden beneath the wrist. And then there was the landscape behind him, a soft valley fading into mist. Trees shaped by wind, water reflecting the pale morning sky. It was not just background, it was atmosphere, it was mood. It was a world alive, breathing, waiting. When Verrocchio stepped back to review the work, his gaze lingered on that single figure. He said nothing at first. Then quietly, he set down his brush. Some say he never painted again. Others claim he simply smiled and nodded. But what is certain is that from that day forward, Leonardo was no longer seen as an apprentice, but as a voice of his own, still young, still unknown beyond the walls of the studio, but already speaking in a language that few could match, a language of quiet truth. Yet even with this quiet recognition, he did not change. He did not seek commissions, nor boast of skill. He did not hang the painting in a public square or tell stories of his triumph. Instead, he returned to his notebooks, filling them with new questions. As if the act of creation had only deepened his hunger to understand. How does light enter the eye? What makes a smile reach the eyes? Can we measure the exact curve of a wave? He began dissecting animals, birds, frogs, dogs, slaying them open with careful hands, tracing muscles, tendons, the paths of blood, not with cruelty but with reverence, as if each creature held a secret written in flesh. He did not do it for horror, nor for spectacle, but to understand the machinery of life, to see how nature engineered movement, balance, flight. He sketched a bat's wing, noting how the membrane stretched between elongated fingers, how it flexed and caught air, how it resembled both a hand and a sail. He measured the proportions of a horse's leg, comparing it to human anatomy, searching for universal patterns, for laws hidden beneath variety. Believed, though he never said it aloud, that nature was not chaotic, but governed by hidden harmonies, laws that could be seen, drawn, perhaps even lived, if one looked closely enough, long enough, with enough love. And so his steps forward were not bold, but deep. He did not leave Florence in triumph. He did not declare himself an artist. He simply continued, painting, drawing, questioning, observing. He walked the streets at dawn when the city was still wrapped in shadow, watching how people moved, how their clothes swayed with their gait, how shadows followed them like silent companions, stretching and shrinking with the rising sun. He stood by the Arno River, studying how water curled around stones, how ripples formed and vanished, how reflections broke and reformed with every passing breeze, as if reality itself were fluid, never fixed. He sat in gardens, listening to birds, sketching their flight paths, trying to capture the exact angle at which they tilted their wings before landing, measuring the rhythm of their beats, wondering if a man might ever learn to fly by understanding them. Each act was small. Each moment passed unnoticed by the world. But together, they formed a current steady, growing, impossible to ignore, like the first green shoot breaking through soil after winter. Like the faint echo of a song heard from far away, like the beginning of a story that has not yet found its name. He also began to dream of things that could not yet exist. In the margins of his notebooks, half hidden beneath anatomical sketches and studies of water flow, he drew machines unlike any ever built, a device with rotating blades that might lift a man into the air, a cart driven by coiled springs, a bridge designed to span a river without supports, its arch perfect, self-supporting, elegant. None of them were practical. None of them were requested. They simply emerged from his mind like visions, possibilities whispered by the wind, glimpses of a future not yet born, drawn with the same care he gave to a leaf or a hand. He did not believe they would be built in his lifetime, but he believed they could be, that belief, that quiet certainty that the world held more than it revealed, that imagination could shape reality was enough to keep him moving, to give him purpose beyond fame, beyond wealth, beyond the approval of men who counted success in coins and contracts. These were his first true steps, not toward glory, not toward legacy, but toward a way of being, a way of seeing the world not as it was accepted, but as it might be understood. He did not walk alone. Alone surrounded him, working, speaking, living their lives, but he moved differently. With slowness, with reverence, with a kind of love for the unseen details that make existence whole. And though no one raised their voice to announce it, though no bells rang or crowds gathered, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but surely. Like the first green shoot breaking through soil after winter. Like the faint echo of a song heard from far away, like the beginning of a story that has not yet found its name. He was no longer just a boy from Vinci. He was becoming someone else, someone still unnamed, still unfolding, but undeniably present, like a shadow growing longer as the sun rises. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel that same gentle momentum within you, the quiet courage it takes to begin, even when no one is watching. Even when the path is unclear, even when you don't know if what you're doing matters. You don't need to know where you're going. You only need to take the next step, with care, with curiosity, with your full attention. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let your breath slow, let your thoughts soften. There is no rush, no destination we must reach. Only this moment, only this voice, only the quiet company of a man who spent his life learning how to see. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. Florence in the closing years of the 15th century did not awaken suddenly to beauty, nor was its transformation announced with fanfare or decree. Instead, it dreamed itself into becoming like a city half awake at dawn, where light spreads not all at once, but in quiet layers, softening edges, revealing form gradually, allowing the soul time to adjust. The mornings came with a pale gold that lingered on stone facades, turning gray walls into something warm and living, as if the very buildings were breathing with the rhythm of those who walked beside them. Along the Arno, mist curled above the water like thoughts rising from deep sleep, dissolving slowly as the sun climbed higher, revealing bridges lined with shops where goldsmiths polished rings shaped like vines and painters ground pigments into powders of lapis lazuli, vermilion, and malachite. The air carried 1,000 scents, fresh bread from ovens stoked before sunrise, damp earth from courtyard gardens, the sharp tang of iron from blacksmith forges, and always, beneath it all, the faint, sweet oil of linseed mingling with candle wax and old wood. There were no clocks loud enough to break the silence, no voices raised in haste, only footsteps on cobblestones, the creak of wooden shutters opening, the distant chime of a bell calling monks to prayer, and somewhere always the sound of a lute drifting from an upper window, its notes hanging in the air like dew on spiderwebs. It was a city learning how to see again, not just with the eyes, but with the hands, the heart, the imagination. For generations, art had served faith, shaped by tradition, bound by rules passed down like sacred texts. But now something subtle was shifting, like a draft beneath a door barely felt, but impossible to ignore. Men began to study anatomy, not only to paint saints more convincingly, but to understand what it meant to be alive. Architects measured sunlight falling across courtyards, calculating angles not just for beauty but for harmony. Scholars pored over ancient manuscripts rescued from forgotten monasteries, finding words that spoke not of obedience, but of wonder that the world might be knowable, that nature followed laws, that truth could be discovered through observation rather than received through authority. And in this slow unfolding, Leonardo moved not as a leader, not as a rebel, but as a presence, a man whose silence carried weight, whose gaze seemed to linger longer than others, whose hands recorded what most people passed by without notice. He did not shout his ideas. He lived them. And because of that, they seeped into the city like water into soil, nourishing unseen roots. He walked its streets often, not with purpose, but with presence, as though every step were a form of listening. At sunrise, he followed the path of light as it climbed the walls of palazzos, watching how shadow retreated inch by inch, how color changed as the angle of the sun shifted from cool blue to warm ochre, from stillness to movement. At midday, he sat near fountains, observing how water splashed and scattered, how droplets caught the sun like tiny stars before vanishing, how the surface trembled when touched, then calmed again, as if remembering its own nature. In the evenings, he lingered by the bridges, leaning slightly against the stone railing, feeling the vibration of carts rolling over arches, listening to the soft murmur of the Arno below, studying how the moon's reflection trembled on the surface, broken by ripples, yet never truly lost. He watched people not as strangers, but as subjects of endless fascination. How a woman adjusted her shawl with a single graceful motion. How a child laughed with eyes closed and head tilted back. How an old man leaned on his cane, his body shaped by decades of walking the same paths, each step slower, heavier, more deliberate. He carried his notebook always, drawing quickly, quietly, never intruding, only recording as if the entire city were a manuscript written in gestures, light, and motion, and he was learning to read it. His drawings began to circulate quietly, not as finished works meant for altars or noble halls, but as glimpses into a mind that saw differently. A study of drapery folded over a chair, rendered so precisely that you could feel the weight of the fabric, the way it gathered in soft valleys and sharp peaks. A sketch of an old man's face, every wrinkle a river of time, the corners of his mouth turned downward, not in sorrow, but in wisdom. A hand holding a sphere, fingers curved with gentle pressure, veins rising beneath translucent skin, light catching the edge of a thumbnail. These were not made for sale or admiration. They were shared among trusted friends, passed from hand to hand like secrets whispered in confidence. Studied in candlelight by those who sensed they were seeing something new, not just skill, but understanding. Where others painted what they knew, Leonardo painted what they felt, capturing not only form, but life, the breath behind the lips, the thought behind the eyes, the memory hidden in a gesture. And slowly people began to seek him not only for beauty, but for insight, as if his way of seeing could reveal truths beyond appearance. A merchant asked him to design a mechanism for lifting barrels onto wagons, not because Leonardo was known as an engineer, but because someone had seen his sketches of pulleys and ropes, drawn not for use but out of curiosity. A priest requested a small altarpiece, not grand or ornate, but one that would make those who knelt before it feel peace, something serene, timeless, alive. A young painter came to him at dusk, holding a half-finished portrait, asking why the face looked correct, yet somehow empty. Leonardo studied it in silence, then said softly, "Look again at how light touches the temple, not just where it falls, but where it leaves. That absence is part of the soul. The painter returned days later weeping, saying he had finally seen what Leonardo meant. These moments were small, unrecorded, forgotten by history, but they mattered. They were echoes of a deeper shift. The idea that art was not decoration, but revelation. That knowledge was not only found in books, but in looking. That to truly see was an act of love. Yet not everyone welcomed this quiet revolution. In a world where mastery was earned through years of rigid training, where artists followed models handed down through centuries, Leonardo's way of working unsettled many. He did not finish everything he began. He abandoned projects, left paintings incomplete, walked away from commissions without explanation. To some, this was irresponsibility. To others, proof of arrogance. A true master completes what he starts, one older painter remarked. Watching Leonardo stare at a half-finished panel for days without touching it, as if waiting for something only he could hear. But Leonardo knew completion was not the same as truth. If the work did not breathe, if it did not carry the pulse of life within it, then finishing it would be a kind of betrayal not of the patron, but of the moment, of the vision, of the invisible thread connecting hand, eye, and heart. So he waited, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, until something inside him shifted, until the image became clear again, until he could continue not out of duty, but out of necessity. This patience, this refusal to rush, baffled those who valued speed and productivity. But it also earned him a different kind of respect, the kind that comes not from noise, but from silence, not from fame, but from presence. Meanwhile, the city continued to change around him, not by force, but by accumulation. New buildings rose along the river, their facades adorned with carvings of mythological creatures and biblical scenes. Each stone placed with care, each column aligned with celestial precision. The great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore stood as a monument to human imagination, a reminder that even the sky could be challenged, that faith and reason could build together. In the piazzas, people gathered not only to trade goods, but to exchange ideas about art, faith, politics, the stars. The printing press had arrived, bringing books faster and cheaper than ever before, spreading knowledge like seeds on wind. Translations of Plato and Aristotle circulated among the wealthy. While ballads and poems about love and war were sung in taverns, their melodies rising into the night. Music filled the air, lutes, flutes, voices rising in harmony during festivals. And always, beneath it all, there was motion. Carts rolling over cobblestones. Monks walking in procession, children chasing each other between columns, pigeons lifting from rooftops in sudden bursts of wings. Florence was alive, breathing, dreaming, and Leonardo moved within it like a current within a river. It's not always visible, but present, shaping the flow. He accepted new commissions, but on his own terms. He painted the Adoration of the Magi, a grand scene of kings and angels, yet left it unfinished. Captivated instead by the horses, their muscles, their expressions, the way light fell across armor, the tension in their legs as they shifted weight, he designed stage sets for courtly entertainments, not just as decoration, but as moving illusions, trapdoors that opened to reveal gods rising from below, mechanisms that made clouds part and stars appear, flying machines that lifted actors gently into the air, suspended by wires so fine they vanished in the light. He consulted on architecture, suggesting ways to improve airflow in buildings, to align windows with sunlight, to make spaces feel not only beautiful, but alive, as if the stones themselves could breathe. Each act was small, each decision quiet, but together. They formed a pattern not of conquest, but of integration, of a mind weaving itself into the fabric of the world, not to dominate it, but to understand it, to harmonize with it, to listen to its hidden rhythms and echo them back in form, in line, in silence. And so, as the world moved around him, Leonardo moved with it, not ahead, not behind, but in step, like a dancer who follows the music without needing to lead. There was no manifesto, no declaration, no gathering of disciples, but in studios, in homes, in the minds of those who saw his work or spoke with him, something had shifted. The idea that art could be science, that curiosity was sacred, that observation was a form of love, these seeds were being planted, not in soil, but in silence. And though few could name what was happening, Many felt it is softening of boundaries, a widening of vision, a sense that the world was more intricate, more mysterious, more beautiful than they had ever imagined. It was not revolution, it was evolution, gentle, deep, almost imperceptible. Like the first green shoot breaking through soil after winter. Like the faint echo of a song heard from far away. Like the beginning of a story that has not yet found its name. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel that same quiet movement within you, not force. Not urgency, but a gentle turning, like a leaf adjusting to the sun. You don't need to announce your growth. You don't need to prove anything. You only need to remain open to the breath in your chest, to the weight of the blanket, to the distant sound of the night. Like Leonardo, you are part of a larger motion, carried forward not by effort, but by attention, by care, by the simple act of noticing what is already here. There is no rush, no destination we must reach. Only this moment, only this voice, only the quiet company of a man who spent his life learning how to see. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. There came a time when the path Leonardo walked was no longer shaped only by curiosity or wonder, but by something quieter, more enduring, not crisis, not defeat, but a slow pressure building beneath the surface of his days. It's like water rising behind an ancient stone wall, unseen yet felt in the subtle shift of the air, in the way silence began to carry more meaning than speech. It was not a single moment that marked this change, nor a loud confrontation or public failure, but a series of small resistances within himself, within the expectations of those around him that gathered over time, not through anger, but through their constant, unspoken presence. He had begun to feel the growing distance between what he saw and what others expected, between the way he moved through work and the way the world demanded things be finished, delivered, proven, judged. People admired his hand, yes, they praised the lifelike eyes of his angels, impossible softness of his shadows, the way light seemed to breathe from his paintings, but they did not always understand his mind, his need to pause, to return, to wait until the inner voice said it was true, not just correct, not just complete, but alive. These questions were rarely spoken aloud to him, never shouted in accusation or frustration. But he heard them all the same, in the hesitation before a patron handed him a new commission, in the way some men glanced at unfinished panels stacked against the wall, in the quiet sigh of a workshop master who once said, "A masterpiece left undone is no masterpiece at all." There was no malice in these moments, no open hostility, only a subtle withdrawal of trust, a growing sense that he was becoming someone difficult to rely on, not because he lacked talent, but because he refused to move at the same pace as everyone else, as if time itself bent differently around him. And though he responded with silence, offering no defense, no justification, these unspoken doubts settled inside him, not as wounds, but as weights, quiet confirmations that to see the world differently was not always welcomed, even in a city like Florence, which claimed to celebrate beauty, invention, and the rebirth of knowledge. He did not rebel, he did not argue, but he felt it, the loneliness of being understood only in fragments, admired for what he made, yet unseen for how he thought, for the depth of attention he gave to a single leaf, a single shadow, a single breath. Within himself, another kind of conflict unfolded, not between right and wrong, but between completion and truth, between the external demand to deliver and the internal need to remain faithful to vision. He believed with every fiber of his being that a work of art should not be released into the world until it carried within it the pulse of life he had observed in nature, in people, in the way light fell across a face at dusk, revealing not just form but feeling. But the world did not wait. Patrons grew impatient. Time passed, seasons turned, commissions expired, and so he found himself caught between two truths. One that demanded he release what he had made, to honor the agreement, to satisfy the expectation, and another that whispered it was not yet ready. That one more line, one more shadow, one more adjustment might bring it closer to what it was meant to be. That to finish too soon would be to betray the very essence of why he painted it all. This was not procrastination. It was devotion. It had carried a cost, unfinished panels stacked in corners. Ideas sketched with fire and never returned to. Projects begun with such intensity they seemed to glow on the page, and abandoned without explanation, as if the mind had already traveled further than the hand could follow. And then there were the doubts, not loud, not paralyzing, but soft, persistent, like the sound of rain on a roof late at night. Barely noticeable until the house falls silent and you realize it has been there all along. Tapping gently, endlessly, shaping the mood without force. Was he truly creating something lasting, or merely collecting observations no one would ever understand? Would any of his machines ever move beyond paper? Would anyone ever look at his anatomical studies and see not just drawings but revelations, maps of the soul written in muscle and bone? He had no students who followed his way entirely, no school born from his teachings. His notebooks were written in mirror script, from right to left, as if even he hesitated to let them be read too easily, as if part of him wished for them to remain hidden, protected from misunderstanding, from mockery, from the hands of those who might use his visions for war rather than wonder. Sometimes, sitting alone by candlelight, turning pages filled with wings, water, faces, skeletons, rivers, hearts, he wondered if all of it would vanish with him. The centuries would remember only a few paintings, while the rest, the true depth of his searching, would remain scattered, unread, lost beneath dust and time. Yet in the midst of this silent struggle, there was also courage, not the kind that shouts, not the kind that charges forward with banners and drums, but the kind that continues without applause, that chooses to look again, to draw once more, to ask another question, even when no one is listening. Even when the world seems to have turned away, he did not stop working. He did not retreat into silence. Instead, he deepened his focus, retreating not from the world, but into it, spending nights in hospital courtyards, where the bodies of the unclaimed were left for study, carefully dissecting hands, arms, faces by the dim glow of oil lamps, tracing muscles, tendons, the delicate network of veins beneath the skin. Recording everything with reverence, as if each body were a temple holding secrets about how life moved through flesh, how breath was sustained, how a person could laugh, weep, reach, hold. He drew the human heart not as a symbol, not as a shape on a banner, but as a machine, complex, rhythmic, alive, trying to understand how blood flowed, how valves opened and closed, how a single organ could sustain an entire existence, pumping tirelessly day after day, year after year, without thought, without rest. He knew this work might never be accepted. He knew the church frowned upon such acts, that to cut open the body was seen by many as a violation of the sacred. But he also knew that to see was an act of respect, that understanding could lead to healing. He faced other pressures, too. The weight of reputation. The expectations of a man now known beyond Florence, whose name carried whispers of genius, of mystery, of someone who could do the impossible. When Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, sent word asking for an artist of great skill, Leonardo did not present himself as a master of completed works, but as a man of many talents, painter, engineer, musician, inventor of machines for war and peace alike, designer of bridges, canals, flying devices, theatrical illusions. He wrote a letter listing his abilities, not with pride but with quiet confidence, ending with a humble note. And like the sky holds both stars and shadows, so too does my mind carry both dreams and duties. It was not a boast. And when the Duke responded, welcoming him to Milan, it was not because Leonardo had finished the most paintings, but because he saw differently, because he offered not just art, but possibility, because he dared to imagine what others could not yet build. Still, the inner tension remained. He arrived in Milan with hope, with notebooks full of sketches, visions of grand murals and flying devices, yet soon found himself caught in courtly demands, designing costumes for festivals, arranging banquets, and building mechanisms for theatrical illusions, crafting automata that moved like living creatures, tasks far removed from the deep work he longed to do. There were moments when he sat in silence, watching snow fall over the city, each flake drifting slowly to the ground, wondering if he had traded one kind of distraction for another, if movement itself was becoming a way to avoid stillness, if the world would always ask for spectacle while he searched for substance, for truth, for the quiet laws that governed motion, growth, life. But even then, he did not give up. He adapted. He used every commission as a door designing stage machinery, led him to study motion. Planning fortifications made him rethink geometry. Painting portraits taught him how emotion lived in the smallest shifts of expression. How a smile could begin in the eyes long before it reached the lips. This was his courage, not in victory, not in recognition, in choosing, again and again, to return to the page, to the canvas, to the quiet study of a leaf, a hand, a drop of water falling into a pool. In refusing to harden into a single identity, artist, scientist, builder, and instead remaining fluid, open, willing to wander, to follow curiosity wherever it led, even if it led nowhere visible, in knowing that doubt was not failure, but part of the process. That uncertainty could coexist with dedication, that silence could hold more power than speech. He did not need to declare his strength. It was in the way he kept working, year after year, through misunderstanding, through abandonment, through the slow erosion of time, through the ache of unfinished things. Like a river shaping stone, not with force, but with persistence, he moved forward not by overcoming resistance, but by flowing through it, by allowing it to reshape him without breaking him. And perhaps, as you listen now, resting in your own quiet space, wrapped in warmth, breathing slowly, letting your thoughts soften like ink dissolving in water, you can feel an echo of that same quiet courage within you, not the kind that demands change, not the kind that seeks to be seen, but the kind that allows you to continue, even when no one sees, even when the path is unclear, even when you doubt whether what you're doing matters. You don't need to finish everything. You don't need to prove yourself. You only need to stay open, to keep breathing, to let your attention rest on what is real, what is true, what calls to you in the stillness. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let us breathe together. The story continue. There came a night in Milan, not marked by thunder or storm, not announced with urgency or fanfare, but wrapped in the deep stillness that follows a long day's work, when the world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, allowing one moment to settle into the fabric of time, with a weight far greater than its simplicity might suggest. A moment so quiet, it could easily have been missed had anyone been rushing through their evening, had any mind been too full of noise to notice the subtle shift in the air. Leonardo sat alone in his chamber, the candle low, its flame trembling slightly in the draught from a half-open window, casting long shadows that danced across the stone walls like silent figures moving through memory, their forms stretching and bending with every flicker, vanishing and returning as if whispering secrets only visible in darkness. Outside, the city had fallen into hush, no carts on cobblestones, no voices in the streets, only the distant bark of a dog and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and old stone. He was tired, not from labor of the body, but from the quiet exhaustion of thought, of having spent hours bent over parchment, sketching the flow of water around an obstacle, measuring angles, tracing curves, searching for the hidden rhythm beneath motion, trying to understand how force moved through space, how resistance shaped direction, how even the smallest deviation could alter the path of everything that followed, just as a single word could change the course of a life. He had been in Milan for several years now, welcomed by Duke Ludovico Sforza, not as a mere painter, not as a craftsman, bound to brush and pigment, but as a man of many minds, artist, engineer, inventor, dreamer, someone who could design war machines with the same care he used to compose a melody for the lute, who could plan canals to redirect rivers and then build mechanical lions that walked forward on their own, releasing flowers from their mouths during courtly festivals where nobles watched in wonder, unaware that behind every illusion was a mind studying the laws of nature, seeking patterns in motion, balance, growth. The court admired him, used him, celebrated him in halls lit with torches and filled with music, yet beneath the spectacle, he felt the familiar tension, the pull between what was asked of him and what he longed to explore, between the external demands of patronage and the internal need to understand, to see clearly, to translate what lived beneath the surface of things into form that others might feel, even if they could not name it. And though he moved through these duties with grace, accepting commissions for banners, costumes, fireworks, and stage mechanisms, they did not satisfy the deepest part of him, the one that sought not applause, not recognition, but truth, not completion, but clarity, a kind of knowing that could only come when hand. Eye and heart moved as one when the act of creation became not performance but prayer. That night, as he sat in silence, turning the pages of his notebook, his fingers tracing the lines of wings, hearts, water spirals, and skeletal hands, he realized he had been waiting not for permission, not for approval, not for a grand opportunity, but for a single image to emerge from the darkness of uncertainty. One that would carry within it the full weight of all he had seen, studied, felt throughout his life, as if every sketch of a leaf, every dissection of a muscle, every observation of light falling across a face had been leading toward this moment without his conscious knowledge. And then it came, not as a shout, not as a vision blazing in the sky, but as a whisper, so soft he almost missed it. The Last Supper. Not merely a painting of Christ and his disciples, not just another religious scene to be placed on a monastery wall and viewed briefly before meals, but a moment suspended in time, a single breath held between words, the instant when Jesus says, "One of you will betray me," and the air itself seems to freeze, charged with emotion, disbelief, sorrow, guilt, love, fear, all gathered in one fragile second that contains the entirety of human experience. He saw it not with his eyes, but with his mind's deeper sight, the faces each reacting differently, some in shock, some in denial, some already retreating inward. The hands, rising, falling, gripping edges, betraying thoughts before words are spoken. The light pouring from above, illuminating the center while leaving the corners in shadow. As if the divine and the human stood side by side, one speaking, the other listening, one knowing, the other's unknowing. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he worked quietly, steadily, filling page after page with sketches, not of the whole, but of fragments, Peter's hand clutching a knife in righteous anger. John's face turned in sorrow, leaning gently against the table, as if too weak to sit upright. Judas leaning back into shadow, his fingers closing around a purse, his body already withdrawing from the group, separated not by distance but by intention. He studied how light fell across a face in profile, how tension tightened the neck, how a man's shoulders dropped when grief arrived, how the eyes avoid contact when guilt takes root. He walked through the monastery refectory in daylight, measuring the wall, calculating perspective, imagining how the image would meet the eyes of monks as they ate their meals, how it might linger in their thoughts long after they had left, how it could become part of their daily contemplation, a mirror held up to their own souls. He delayed the start, not out of hesitation, not from doubt in his ability, but out of reverence. This was not just another commission, it was a crossing, a threshold. And he would not step forward until he could see it clearly, until every line carried meaning, till the painting breathed on its own, until it contained not only what happened, but what it meant to be human in that moment. When he finally began, he did so with a method unlike any other artist of his time, guided not by tradition, but by necessity. He abandoned the traditional fresco technique, which required fast work on wet plaster because it forced haste, and haste was the enemy of truth, of nuance, of the delicate shifts in expression that made a face alive. Instead, he experimented, applying layers of gesso, pitch, and oil to the dry wall, creating a surface that allowed him to work slowly, to adjust, to refine, to wait, to return again and again, as if the painting were growing rather than being made. It was risky. The materials were untested. Some warned him it would not last, that the colors would flake, the outlines blur, the image fade within years. But he knew that to capture this moment, so delicate, so profound, so full of invisible currents, he could not rush. He needed time. He needed silence. He needed the freedom to observe, to correct, to deepen, to let the work unfold as naturally as a river finds its course. And so, day after day, he climbed the scaffolding, brush in hand, surrounded by the presence of those 12 men who existed only in his mind, yet felt more real to him than many of the people who passed through the hall below, their voices echoing faintly as they ate, unaware that above them a story was being born. The monks grew accustomed to his presence, to the way he sometimes stood for long minutes without painting, simply watching. As if listening to a conversation only he could hear, his head tilted slightly, his eyes moving from one figure to another, adjusting a fold of cloth, deepening a shadow beneath an arm, softening the edge of a cheekbone until it caught the light just right. Occasionally, he would call for models not to copy their faces, but to study their movements, their expressions, their gestures. I asked one to clench his fist in anger, another to look startled, another to weep silently, another to turn away in shame. He observed how a man's brow furrowed when confused, how his lips trembled when afraid, how his eyes avoided contact when guilty, how a simple gesture, the placing of a hand on the table, could reveal loyalty, doubt, or betrayal. And slowly, the image emerged, not all at once, but piece by piece. Like a memory returning after years of forgetting, like a song remembered note by note. The composition unfolded with mathematical precision, a perfect harmony of lines converging on Christ at the center, yet radiated emotional chaos, as if the force of the words had sent waves through the room, disrupting peace, exposing hearts. Christ sat at the center, calm, symmetrical, a still point in the storm, his hands open, his posture serene, untouched by the turbulence around him, while the disciples erupted in pairs, their bodies leaning, turning, recoiling. Reaching, grouped in threes like waves breaking against a shore, each cluster expressing a different emotion: outrage, confusion, sorrow, denial, fear. Above them, the ceiling opened into arches of light, drawing the eye upward, suggesting that even in betrayal there was grace, that even in loss there was continuity, that love could endure even when broken. The room itself felt alive, not static, but breathing, shaped by perspective so precise it seemed the wall had dissolved, replaced by a real space where one could walk in and sit at the table. And yet, despite its brilliance, he knew it would not be perfect. In fact, he suspected it would not last. The experimental technique, though allowing him the time he needed, made the pigments unstable. Within years, the colors would begin to flake, the outlines blur, the image fade. Future generations would see it damaged, restored, altered, never as he intended. But even as the painting took shape, he continued. Not for fame, not for legacy, not for the approval of the Duke or the admiration of the clergy, but because this moment mattered, because it was about more than religion, more than doctrine, more than faith. It was about humanity, about how we react when truth is spoken, about how loyalty and betrayal can sit side by side at the same table, how love persists even when it knows it will be broken, how silence can speak louder than words. And in that understanding, he found a kind of peace, not the absence of doubt, not the end of questioning, but the presence of purpose, the sense that after years of wandering, of studying wings, hearts, water, light, he had finally created something that carried the full weight of his seeing, something that invited not just admiration, but reflection, not just observation, but feeling. This was the moment when all his unfinished things, all his abandoned projects, all his notebooks filled with questions, finally coalesced into something whole, not in form but in essence, not in permanence but in meaning. That night, and the months that followed, became a quiet turning point. Not because the world changed, not because crowds gathered or kings praised him, but because he changed. He stepped across an invisible line, from making art to living within it, from observing life to revealing it, from collecting knowledge to offering understanding. He no longer saw himself as a painter or an inventor or a scientist, but as someone for whom all boundaries had dissolved. Someone whose entire life, every sketch of a wing, every study of water, every dissection of a heart had been leading to this. A single mural on a monastery wall, meant to be seen by men who ate simple meals and prayed in silence, who carried their own sorrows and hopes within them. And though he would go on to create other works, to dream new machines, to fill countless pages with questions, nothing would feel quite the same. This was the center, the still point, the moment when all paths converged, not in triumph, but in truth. As you listen now, perhaps you can feel that same quiet shift within you, not a loud transformation, not a sudden breakthrough, not a victory declared, but a soft reordering of the soul, like the first warmth of dawn touching a cold field. It's like the moment you realize you've been carrying something heavy for so long that you forgot it was there. And now, gently you set it down. You don't need to know why it happens. You don't need to name it. You only need to remain open, to let it unfold, to trust that even the smallest decision, the quietest choice, the most uncertain step, can lead you to a place you were always meant to be, not because you planned it, but because you stayed true to what you saw, what you felt, what called to you in the stillness. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. There came a season in Milan when the light changed, not suddenly, not with drama, but gradually, as it always does, like breath slowing in deep rest. As if the city itself were learning how to let go, how to release what could no longer be held. The mornings arrived wrapped in pale mist that clung to the rooftops and softened the edges of towers, turning stone into memory, sound into echo, presence into something almost dreamlike, as though reality had grown thin at the edges and allowed the past to seep through. Leaves began to fall from the plane trees along the canals, drifting slowly to the water's surface, where they floated like tiny boats carrying nothing but time, their reflections trembling with every ripple. Breaking and reforming like thoughts half-remembered, Leonardo walked these paths more often now, not with purpose, not toward any destination, but with presence. His steps quiet on the damp earth, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his cloak, his eyes observing not just what was before him, but what lingered beneath, the way shadows grew longer, earlier each day. How voices carried differently in the cool air. How even laughter seemed softer. As if the world had lowered its voice in reverence for something passing, for a chapter closing without announcement. For a man who had given years of his life to this place, and now felt it slipping away like sand through open fingers. He had completed the Last Supper, or at least released it into the world. Though he knew it was already beginning to fade, the colors lifting from the wall like breath from skin, the outlines blurring as moisture seeped into the experimental layers beneath. The faces he had studied so deeply now softening into ghostly impressions, as if the figures themselves were dissolving back into silence. He had known this would happen. He had accepted it, not with resignation, not with bitterness, but with understanding that some things are made not to last, but to be felt, not to endure in pigment, but in memory. In the quiet pause of a monk who looks up from his meal and sees something in the painting that speaks without words, that moves him not because it is perfect, but because it is true. And yet, even as the image faded, its meaning deepened. Spreading beyond the refectory walls, whispered about in corridors, copied by other artists, studied by those who sensed it held a truth they could not name, a moment suspended between love and betrayal, between knowing and denial, between divine stillness and human chaos. But for Leonardo, the completion of the work did not bring triumph, nor peace, nor even satisfaction. It brought silence, a hollow space where energy had once flowed, a stillness so profound it felt like loss. Not of the painting, not of recognition, but of the moment it had occupied. The intensity of focus, the unity of thought in hand, the sense that every breath had been part of a single act of seeing. Now, that fire had cooled, and he was left with embers, with questions. With the slow return of doubt, the quiet whisper that perhaps nothing truly lasts, that all effort, however deep, is eventually swallowed by time. And then came the war. Not with thunder, not with siege engines, not with armies storming gates in flames, but with the distant rumble of cavalry approaching from the north, the shifting of alliances, the sudden departure of patrons, the closing of workshops, the silencing of music in the halls where he had once built illusions that made angels descend from painted skies, where fountains danced with mechanical grace, where men believed for a moment that magic was real. The French army advanced under King Louis XII and Ludovico Sforza, the duke who had welcomed him, who had given him years of shelter and purpose, fled into exile, abandoned by those he trusted, betrayed by allies who once knelt before him. Milan, once vibrant with creation, became a city of whispers, of doors closing quietly, of men measuring their words, of glances exchanged in corners, of fear settling into the bones of the streets. The court dissolved, commissions vanished. The very air seemed heavier, laced with uncertainty. The knowledge that power could vanish in a single night, that loyalty was fragile, that beauty meant nothing when survival was at stake. And in that shift, Leonardo found himself adrift, not in danger, not in poverty, but in displacement, as if the ground beneath his feet had softened, as if the path he had followed for so long had simply disappeared beneath rising water, leaving him standing on uncertain soil, unsure of where to step next. He stayed at first, hoping the storm would pass, continuing small works, studying optics, sketching the movement of clouds, measuring the angles of light through stained glass, trying to anchor himself in observation, in the familiar rhythm of inquiry. But the rhythm of life had changed. The monks no longer greeted him with warmth. Their eyes were distant, preoccupied with survival, with prayer, with the fate of their order. The streets felt watchful, as if every stranger might be a spy, every conversation a risk. Even the river seemed darker, its surface dull, reflecting nothing, carrying debris downstream like memories too heavy to keep. And then one morning, while reviewing his notebooks by the dim glow of dawn, he realized how much had already been lost, not only to war, not only to political collapse, but to time itself. Pages had warped from humidity. Ink had bled into fibers, blurring lines he had drawn with such care. Drawings of flying machines, anatomical studies, designs for bridges and canals, all fragile, vulnerable, existing only as long as paper endured. Only as long as someone chose to preserve them. No one else understood them. No student had learned his mirror script. No apprentice had followed his way of seeing. His ideas lived in silence, buried in leather-bound volumes that might one day be discarded, burned, used to wrap bread or kindle fires. For the first time, he felt the weight of impermanence, not as a philosophical idea, not as an abstract concept, but as a quiet sorrow, that a lifetime of attention, of patience, of relentless curiosity might vanish as if it had never been, that all he had seen, all he had recorded, could dissolve into nothing, like mist under morning sun. Yet within that sorrow, something else stirred, not hope, not ambition, not the desire for fame, but clarity, deep and calm, like water finding its level after a storm. He began to see that loss was not failure, but transformation, that nothing truly disappeared, not the hours spent watching water spiral around a rock, not the care placed in a single line that captured the curve of a smile, not the nights of dissecting hands by candlelight, tracing tendons, feeling how life moved through flesh. These moments had shaped him, and in shaping him, they had shaped the world, however invisibly. A single drawing of a heart might one day help a physician understand blood flow. A study of wings might inspire a man centuries later to build a machine that flies. A painting that fades may still change how someone sees love, betrayal, silence. And so he did not despair. Instead, he packed his notebooks carefully, wrapping them in oilcloth to protect them from rain and dust, tying them with cord, handling them as one might carry a child, not with pride, but with tenderness, with responsibility. He would not leave them behind. He would carry them forward wherever he went, not as treasures to be displayed, but as seeds, fragile, patient, waiting for soil, for a mind ready to receive them, for a future that could not yet be imagined. When he finally left Milan, it was not with fanfare, not with a grand farewell, not with crowds gathered to honor him, but in the early hours of a foggy morning, walking alone through empty streets, his belongings carried by a single servant who asked no questions, his mind full of memories, not regrets. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he could not stay. Rome, Venice, perhaps. Or perhaps somewhere quieter, somewhere green and still, where the air was clearer, where the pace of life matched the rhythm of his thoughts, where he could walk without being recognized, without expectation, without the weight of being someone important. As he passed the monastery where the Last Supper hung on the wall, now already showing signs of decay, paint flaking at the edges, the colors dulled by damp, he paused. Not to mourn, not to lament what was vanishing, but to acknowledge to the work, to the years, to the man he had been while creating it. He placed a hand briefly against the cold stone of the outer wall, as if saying goodbye to a friend, then turned and continued. His footsteps, muffled by dew-soaked cobblestones, disappearing into the mist like a shadow returning to the earth, like a thought dissolving into silence. In the months that followed, he moved slowly, like a leaf carried by a stream, accepting short commissions here and there, offering advice on engineering problems, designing fountains, studying the flow of rivers, measuring gradients, calculating pressure. He lived not in palaces, not in grand studios, but in modest rooms, above bakeries or near quiet courtyards, where the only sounds at night were the chirping of crickets and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the cooling air. Each evening by candlelight, he wrote in his notebooks, filling pages with reflections, observations, questions that had no answers. Because he sought closure, but because the act of writing was a form of breathing, a way to remain present. He wrote about aging, how his hands trembled slightly now, how his eyes needed more light, how memory played tricks, bringing back moments from childhood with startling clarity while yesterday blurred into haze. He did not resist it. He studied it, as he studied everything, with tenderness, with curiosity, as if the slowing of his pulse were as worthy of attention as the flight of a bird. He also began to teach, not formally, not in a school, not with students seated in rows, but through quiet example, through moments of shared seeing. A young painter came to him one evening, holding a sketch, asking how to make a face feel alive. Leonardo took the drawing, studied it in silence for a long time, then said, "Look not at the eyes, but at the space between them." That is where thought begins. Another asked why he kept returning to the same subjects, water, flight, anatomy, as if he had not already explored them enough. "Because I have not finished seeing them," he replied softly. To see once is not to understand. To see 100 times is still not enough. Each time, the light is different. Each time, I am different. These moments were small, unrecorded, forgotten by history. But they mattered not because they built a legacy, not because they would be remembered, but because they passed on a way of being, a way of paying attention, of honoring the unseen details that make existence whole, of knowing that depth is not found in speed, but in slowness, in repetition, in the willingness to return again and again to what calls you. And so, in this period of transition, of quiet wandering, of letting go, he learned the deepest lesson of all, that loss is not emptiness, but space. Space for reflection, space for growth, space for new light to enter. He had lost patrons, stability, permanence, recognition. He had lost the comfort of belonging to a court, of having a defined role, of being needed. But he had not lost his vision. He had not lost his curiosity. He had not lost the ability to wonder. And as long as that remained, he was not diminished. He was free. Free to move without expectation. Free to create without demand. Free to explore, not for glory, but for the sake of knowing, of feeling, of being present in a world that was endlessly mysterious, endlessly beautiful. He no longer needed to prove anything. He no longer needed to finish. He only needed to continue, gently, patiently, like a river that does not rush, but flows. As you listen now, resting in your own quiet space, wrapped in warmth, breathing slowly, letting your thoughts soften like ink dissolving in water, perhaps you can feel that same gentle truth within you, that what you have lost is not gone, but transformed, that every ending carries a quiet beginning, that even in stillness, there is motion. Even in darkness, there is light. You do not need to hold on tightly. You do not need to understand everything. You only need to remain open to your breath, to the weight of the blanket, to the soft hum of the world outside. Like Leonardo, you are part of a larger unfolding, carried forward not by force but by presence, by care, by the simple act of noticing what is already here, by the quiet courage of continuing, even when no one is watching. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. There came a time when the world began to notice what Leonardo had carried in silence for so many years, not because he announced it, not because he sought recognition, not with proclamations or public displays, but because the weight of his presence, though gentle, could no longer be ignored. Like a river that flows unseen beneath the earth until it suddenly surfaces and reshapes the land, carving valleys not with force but with persistence. He was older now, his hair long and silver white, gathered loosely at the nape of his neck, his beard streaked with gray, his face lined not by sorrow, but by decades of looking eyes that had studied the flight of birds at dawn, the pulse of blood beneath skin, the way light bends as it passes through water. His hands were still steady, though marked by time, the veins rising like delicate rivers beneath thin skin, the fingers slightly crooked from years of holding charcoal, brush, scalpel. He moved more slowly, not from weakness, but from a kind of gravity, as if each step required deeper consideration, as if he were listening not only to the earth beneath his feet, but to the echoes of all the paths he had walked before, the sketches left unfinished, the questions never answered, the dreams drawn in margins and never built. And yet, even in this quiet phase of life, something new began to stir, not within him alone, but around him, in the way people spoke of his work, in the way younger artists studied his sketches as if they were sacred texts, in the way rulers and scholars began to seek him not for spectacle, but for wisdom, as if his very existence had become a bridge between what was known and what might one day be understood, a living thread connecting curiosity to revelation. He had spent decades in motion, from Florence to Milan, from court to solitude, from painting to invention, from observation to reflection, following no fixed path, answering no single calling, but moving always toward deeper seeing, guided not by ambition, but by an unshakable need to understand the hidden patterns beneath the surface of things. And now, without announcement or ceremony, he found himself drawn toward a different kind of purpose, one not built on commissions or patronage, but on continuity, on the quiet transmission of a way of seeing that had been shaped by a lifetime of attention, patience, and reverence for the ordinary miracle of existence. He did not call himself a teacher, nor did he gather students in a formal school, nor did he lecture in halls where voices echoed with authority. But men came to him anyway, painters who had traveled for weeks, engineers curious about his designs, physicians searching for insight into the human body, drawn by stories whispered in workshops and libraries, of the man who dissected hearts by candlelight, who designed machines that could fly, who painted a smile that seemed to follow you across the room, not with movement, but with presence. They arrived with questions, with sketches trembling in their hands, with notebooks filled with their own attempts to understand light, motion, anatomy, balance, and he received them not with lectures, not with corrections, but with stillness, asking them first to look, wait, to study, to return again and again to the same subject, until they saw not just its form, but its essence, until they stopped trying to capture it and began to feel it. His reputation grew not through praise, not through statues or inscriptions, but through presence. Word spread quietly like mist over fields at dawn, of the aging master who lived simply, who spoke little, who carried leather-bound notebooks filled with writing that flowed backward across the page, from right to left, as if protecting its secrets from careless eyes, as if even the act of reading required effort, respect, intention. Scholars tried to decipher them. Artists copied fragments with trembling hands. Patrons offered riches for a single drawing, promising gold, titles, protection. But Leonardo did not sell his pages. He kept them close, adding to them daily, not for legacy, not for fame, but because the act of recording was part of his breath, as natural as inhaling and exhaling, as necessary as feeling the sun on his face or hearing the rustle of leaves in the wind. And yet, despite his silence, the ideas within those books began to ripple outward. A physician in Bologna studied his anatomical sketches and recognized the valves of the heart long before science confirmed them, tracing the flow of blood with awe. An engineer in Venice read his notes on water flow and redesigned an aqueduct, aligning its curves with the vortices Leonardo had drawn decades earlier. A painter in Rome recreated the soft shadows of the Last Supper after hearing descriptions from a monk who had seen it whole, capturing not the image but the mood, the tension, the breath held between words. None of them knew how much they owed to him. None of them could trace the thread back to its source. But the thread was there, invisible, patient, stretching across time. Carried forward not by proclamation, but by quiet influence. Even his unfinished works began to speak in ways he never intended, not as failures, not as abandoned efforts, but as living things caught mid-breath, mid-motion, mid-thought. The adoration of the Magi left behind in Florence, abandoned decades earlier with only outlines and underpainting visible, remained in a monastery not displayed in glory, but studied in quiet rooms by apprentices who marveled at the movement in the horses, the chaos of emotion in the crowd, the way light fell across armor and cloth as if alive, shifting with every change in the candle's flame. They did not see it as incomplete, they saw it as revelation, proof that art did not need to be finished to be true, that sometimes the most powerful moments are those suspended in uncertainty, in becoming, in the space between intention and realization. And Mona Lisa, the portrait of a merchant's wife, painted slowly, layer by layer, over years. with glazes so thin they seemed to glow from within, became something more than a painting. It became a presence. Visitors stood before her not to admire technique, not to analyze brushwork, but to feel something, a connection, a mystery, a sense that she saw them as clearly as they saw her, that her gaze followed them not with magic, but with depth. Her smile did not belong to any single emotion, but to all of them: joy, sorrow, knowing, patience, memory, and in that ambiguity, people found space for their own feelings, as if she held a mirror not to her face, but to the soul, reflecting not what was, but what could be. Kings began to hear of him, not because he declared himself great, not because he sent emissaries or demanded audiences, but because greatness, when lived quietly, eventually finds its way into the ears of power, carried on whispers, on copies of drawings, on the awe in a young artist's voice when describing what they had seen. King Francis I of France, a young ruler with a passion for art and beauty, who believed that wisdom was the highest form of nobility, sent a message inviting Leonardo to reside in his court, not as a servant, not as a craftsman bound to paint walls or design fountains, but as a guest, as a friend, as a man whose mind was worth sheltering, whose thoughts were more valuable than gold. There was no demand for paintings, no request for inventions, no expectation of productivity, only an offer of peace, of safety, of a place where he could work without fear, without haste, without the weight of war or politics, where he could walk in gardens, sit by streams, draw until his hand tired, and rest when he needed. And so in the final years of his life, Leonardo crossed the Alps, not in search of fame, not driven by necessity, but in search of stillness, riding slowly on horseback, wrapped in warm wool, his notebooks wrapped carefully beside him. Tied with cord and sealed against rain, his body weary but his spirit unbroken, entering a land of green hills and quiet rivers, where the air smelled of blooming chestnut trees, and the sound of fountains played softly in palace gardens, where birds sang at dawn, and fireflies blinked above the grass at night like stars fallen to earth. He settled in the small chateau of Closeleuce, near the king's residence at Amboise, a modest house surrounded by orchards and streams, its stone walls warmed by centuries of sun, its windows opening onto fields where children played and deer passed silently through the trees. It was not grand, not adorned with gold or marble, but it was peaceful, filled with light, with space, with the freedom to walk, to sit, to think, to forget time. The king visited often, not to command, not to demand answers, but to listen. Sitting beside him for hours in the garden or by the fireplace, watching as he sketched flying machines with delicate lines, explained the spiral of blood through the heart, described the way light bends in water like a serpent turning in a stream. He called him Mon Père, my father, not by blood, not by law, but by wisdom, recognizing that this quiet man carried knowledge deeper than any library, broader than any empire, a mind that had spent a lifetime asking questions others had never thought to ask. And Leonardo, in turn, gave freely not treasures, not completed masterpieces, not inventions ready to be built, but conversation, insight, the slow unfolding of a mind that had spent a lifetime wondering, questioning, observing, loving the world not for what it was, but for what it might reveal if looked at long enough. Yet even here, in this sanctuary, surrounded by kindness and safety, he did not stop. His hands still moved across paper, his eyes still followed the flight of birds circling above the forest. His mind still questioned the nature of things, as if curiosity were not a habit, but a condition of being alive. He drew plans for ideal cities, where canals carried clean water beneath elevated streets, where buildings were aligned with sunlight to warm homes in winter and shade them in summer, where trees grew between houses and fountains brought music to courtyards, imagining a world where design served not power, not wealth, but life itself, where beauty and function walked together. He returned to his studies of water, tracing vortices, measuring currents, trying to understand why some flows were smooth and others chaotic, believing that in these patterns lay the secret to motion itself, that if he could understand how water turned, he might understand how blood moved, how air lifted wings, how the universe itself turned on its axis. He wrote about the moon, speculating that its light came from reflected sunlight, that its surface might be rough like Earth's, covered in mountains and valleys, that perhaps it, too, held mysteries waiting to be seen. That one day someone might look up and wonder what it felt like to stand upon it. None of these works were meant for publication. None were labeled as discoveries. They were simply thoughts set down, like footprints in sand, knowing the tide would come, but choosing to leave them anyway. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to change around him. Not because of decrees or battles, not with fire or conquest, but because of the quiet persistence of ideas, like roots growing beneath stone, unseen but unstoppable. Younger artists adopted his techniques, the soft blending of shadows, the deep psychological presence in portraits, the careful study of nature not as decoration but as truth. Engineers revisited his drawings of gears, bridges, and flying devices. It's not laughing at them as fantasy, but studying them as possibility, as blueprints for a future not yet born. Tracing the mechanics of a machine meant to fly with bat-like wings, realizing that the principles were sound, that the dream was not madness, but foresight. Physicians found his anatomical sketches far ahead of their time, revealing structures of the heart, brain, muscles that would not be confirmed for centuries. Marveling at how he had seen what no one else could, not with instruments, but with attention. And though he never saw airplanes soar or surgical techniques inspired by his notes, though he never knew that one day museums would guard his pages like sacred texts, his presence continued to grow, not as a myth, not as a legend carved in stone, but as a current flowing beneath the surface of human thought, shaping how we see, how we question, how we dare to imagine, teaching us that to look closely is an act of love, that patience is not wasted time, that understanding is not found in haste, but in stillness. This was his legacy, not in statues, not in titles, not in wealth, not in the number of paintings completed or machines built, but in the quiet transformation of how people looked at the world. He did not teach through rules, not through doctrine, not through schools or institutions, but through example. Through the simple act of paying attention, of staying with a question long after others had moved on, of drawing the same wing 10 times, 20 times, until something shifted inside him and he saw not just feathers, but flight. He showed that curiosity was not distraction, but devotion. That patience was not laziness, but precision. That to truly see was not to glance, but to stay, to remain present, to return again and again, to let understanding unfold like a flower opening in spring, petal by petal, without rush. And because of that, he became not just a man of the Renaissance, but a timeless voice, speaking not only to those who lived in his time, but to anyone, anywhere, who has ever paused to wonder why a leaf spirals, why a bird turns in flight, why a smile can hold the weight of a lifetime, why light falls the way it does, why the heart beats without thought, why we are here at all. As you listen now, resting in your own quiet space, wrapped in warmth, breathing slowly, letting your thoughts soften like ink dissolving in water, perhaps you can feel that same presence within you, not as pressure, not as expectation, not as a demand to achieve or create, but as permission. Permission to look closely, to ask gently, to move slowly, to create not for applause, but for truth. You do not need to be remembered. You do not need to finish everything. You only need to pay attention to your breath, to the weight of the blanket, to the distant hum of the world outside, to the quiet rhythm of your own being. Like Leonardo, you are part of a larger unfolding, and every small act of seeing, of caring, of staying present, sends ripples forward into a future you will never see, but that will carry your light all the same. Not because you shouted, because you stayed, because you looked, because you loved the world enough to wonder about it, deeply, quietly, endlessly. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. Long after he had ceased to walk among them, long after his footsteps faded from the stone paths of Close Loose, after the ink on his final sketches had dried and the candlelight that once illuminated his hands had burned down to nothing, time began to gather around the memory of Leonardo like mist, settling over a quiet lake. Not all at once, but gradually, softly, as if the world itself were learning how to remember him without noise, without monuments, without the need to name or claim. It was not a sudden reverence carved in marble, not a statue raised in a public square, not a name shouted in history books, but something deeper, a slow recognition that lingered in the way artists paused before a shadow, in how engineers studied an old sketch and saw not fantasy, but foresight, in how a physician reading notes written in mere scripts centuries later felt a strange kinship, as if someone had already walked the path they thought they were discovering alone, as if the silence between one heartbeat and the next had been measured by a hand long turned to dust. His body was gone, returned to earth beneath the chapel floor at Angboyas, where ivy crept along the walls and rain tapped gently on the roof, where birds nested in the rafters and children played in the orchard just beyond the gate. But his presence did not vanish. It dissolved into the air, into the silence between thoughts, into the quiet act of looking closely at the world, as if he had become not a man remembered, but a way of seeing that now lived beyond him, carried forward not by proclamation, but by attention, not by fame, but by the simple act of someone else choosing to wonder. Years passed, then decades, then generations, and still. His notebooks traveled not always with honor, not always protected, not always kept together, but carried forward by curiosity, by chance, by hands that did not always understand what they held, yet sensed its weight, as if touching the pages was to touch a current of thought that refused to stop flowing. Some were lost, scattered during wars, buried in forgotten archives. Used as wrapping paper in distant markets, their delicate drawings of hearts and wings folded around loaves of bread or parcels of cloth, vanishing into the ordinary fabric of life. Others were copied, studied, misinterpreted, admired for their artistry while their meaning remained hidden, dismissed as the dreams of a man too curious for his own time. Kings and scholars collected them, not knowing whether to call them science or poetry, anatomy or prophecy, storing them in locked cabinets, displaying them to guests as curiosities, unaware that within those fragile sheets lay seeds waiting for soil. Ideas so far ahead of their time that they would not be understood for centuries, and yet, even when misunderstood, they stirred something, a quiet unease with accepted truths. A growing sense that nature followed laws not written in scripture, but visible to those who looked long enough. That light bent in water, that blood flowed in spirals, that flight was possible if one studied the bat, not the bird. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world changed its shape around what he had left behind, not because of decrees or revolutions, not with fire or conquest, but because of the quiet persistence of ideas that refused to die, like roots growing beneath stone, reshaping the ground without force, teaching humanity that to understand was not to accept, but to look, to touch, to wonder, to return again and again until something inside shifted and said, "Now I see." Artists no longer painted faces as masks, fixed and formal, but as living things, searching for the subtle shift in the eyes, the tension in the lips, the breath beneath the skin, because one man had shown them how to see, not with technique, but with patience, with love. Engineers stopped thinking only in straight lines and rigid structures and began to study curves, spirals, vortices. As one man had drawn water not as flat, not as static, but as alive, moving, responding to resistance, carrying energy in its flow. Physicians, once bound by ancient texts that claimed the heart was the seat of emotion and the liver produced blood, began to question, to observe, to dissect, because one man had done so in silence, by candlelight, with reverence, tracing valves, chambers, the spiral of blood through the aorta, drawing them with such precision that centuries later, surgeons would pause before operating. Recognizing the same structures in his sketches, realizing he had seen what no instrument could reveal in his time. Even his unfinished works took on new life, not as failures, not as abandoned efforts, but as invitations, open spaces where others could enter and continue the journey. The adoration of the Magi, left incomplete in Florence, remained untouched for years, then became a pilgrimage for young painters who stood before it in silence, tracing the chaos of emotion, the movement of horses, the way light fell across armor like liquid gold, feeling the energy frozen in motion, as if the scene were still unfolding, waiting for someone to breathe into it. They did not mourn its incompleteness. They celebrated it, for in its open spaces, in its raw underpainting, in the ghostly outlines of figures never finished, they found freedom. They saw that creation did not require perfection, that sometimes the most powerful moments are those caught mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-becoming. That to leave something unfinished was not to fail, but to trust that someone else might carry it forward. And Mona Lisa, the quiet woman from Florence, traveled across borders, survived fires, wars, thefts, and still remained, not because of her value, not because of the oak panel she was painted on, but because of her presence, the way her gaze followed you, not with magic, but with depth. As if she knew you were there, as if she had been waiting. Kings and museums claimed her, displayed her behind bulletproof glass, lit her with precision, guarded her like treasure, built entire rooms around her stillness, and yet none of them truly owned her. She belonged to the moment, to the stillness, to the space between breaths, just as Leonardo had intended, painted not for display, but for understanding, layer by layer, glaze by glaze, over years, until she seemed to breathe, to think, to know something just beyond reach. Generations stood before her, not to admire technique, not to analyze brushwork, but to feel something, a connection, a mystery, a smile that seemed to change with the light, with the viewer, with time itself. She became more than a portrait. She became a companion to solitude, a mirror to the unseen parts of ourselves. Proof that a single gaze rendered with patience and love could outlive empires. Survive chaos, endure loss, and still say, quietly, I am here. As centuries unfolded, his story softened into myth, then re-emerged as truth, not all at once, but in waves, like tides returning to shore. Scholars piece together his life from letters, workshop records, faded sketches, trying to reconstruct the man behind the legend, often missing the point entirely, focusing on what he achieved rather than how he saw, measuring him by completion instead of curiosity. Biographers wrote of his genius, of his divine talent, reducing him to a label, a category, when he had spent his life resisting categories. But those who read his notebooks, who traced his backward script with their fingers, who lingered on a marginal note about the way light bends in water or why birds tilt their wings before landing, felt something deeper, a kinship, a recognition, as if they had met a kindred spirit who had lived long before them, who had also stayed up late wondering, who had also felt the world too deeply to ever finish anything. Because every answer led to another question, every discovery opened a door to a room still dark, because to stop was to betray the very act of seeing. And so, the memory of him did not fade, it transformed. He became less a man of the Renaissance, less a genius trapped in a golden age, and more a timeless voice, speaking not through sermons or manifestos, but through quiet example, through the simple act of paying attention, staying with a question long after others had moved on, of drawing the same wing 10 times, 20 times, till something shifted inside him and he saw not just feathers, but flight, not just form, but function, not just beauty, but law. He showed that curiosity was sacred, that patience was power, that beauty and science were not separate realms, but woven from the same thread. That to paint a face was to study a soul, to draw a river was to understand motion, to dissect a heart was to honor life. He taught that to draw a leaf was not merely to copy its shape, but to honor its life, its veins, its place in the sun, its role in the great cycle of breath. He revealed that the human heart could be studied not only as a pump, but as a symbol of all we feel. Not that to truly see was not to glance, but to stay, to remain present. To let understanding unfold like a flower opening, petal by petal, without rush, without demand. Time gathered around his memory not with fanfare, but with stillness, in the hush of a library where a student studies an anatomical sketch, in the pause of a painter adjusting a shadow, in the breath of a scientist observing flight, in the child who lies on the grass watching clouds and wonders how they move. His legacy was not in what was completed, not in the number of paintings signed or machines built, but in what was set in motion, ideas that moved like rivers beneath the surface of thought, shaping minds long after he was gone, teaching us that observation is an act of love, that doubt is not failure, but part of the process, that to ask a question is to open a door, even if you never walk through it. He did not seek to be remembered, he only sought to understand. And in that seeking, he became unforgettable. Not because he conquered, but because he cared deeply, because he looked longer than anyone else, because he believed that even the smallest thing, a drop of water, a fingerprint, a sigh, held within it the echo of the universe, that to pay attention was the highest form of respect. Even now, in this quiet moment as you listen, his presence lingers, not in grand gestures, but in the soft permission to wonder, to move slowly, out, to create without needing to finish, to exist without proving, out. You do not need to build flying machines or paint masterpieces. You only need to stay with your breath, to notice the way light falls across your room, to feel the weight of the blanket, to let your thoughts drift like leaves on a stream. In that stillness, you are not separate from him. You are part of the same current, the same quiet courage, the same endless search for meaning in the details, in the overlooked and the seemingly small. Like Leonardo, you are part of a larger unfolding, and though your name may never be spoken in history, though your thoughts may never be recorded, your way of seeing, your quiet courage to remain present, sends ripples forward into a future you will never see, but that will carry your light all the same. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. Even now, centuries after his hand last touched charcoal, after his eyes closed beneath the quiet trees of Angbois, after his notebooks were scattered like seeds across continents and time, the presence of Leonardo still moves among us, not in statues that rise against the sky, not in museums filled with hushed voices and golden frames, not in the names we repeat during lectures or read in biographies printed on smooth paper, but in the quiet act of looking closely, of asking gently, of staying with a question long after others have turned away, as if curiosity itself had taken root in the human soul and grown into something eternal. His voice does not echo in halls or books alone, but in the pause before a brush meets canvas, in the way a scientist adjusts a lens to see deeper into the structure of a cell, in the child who lies on the grass watching a bird turn in the sky and wonders not just how it flies, but why it knows which way to go, what unseen currents guide it, how its wings catch the air with such effortless grace. He is not gone. He is simply dissolved into the rhythm of attention itself, becoming not a figure of history, but a current within it, subtle, persistent, alive, carried forward not by memory, but by the simple, sacred act of paying attention, as if every moment of seeing is a continuation of his life. A quiet reply to all he once asked of the world, a silent answer whispered back across time. You feel him not in grand gestures, not in monuments carved from marble, but in stillness, in the way light falls across a table in the late afternoon, revealing textures you had never noticed. The grain of the wood rising like a landscape under golden dust, the faint shadow of a glass bending around its curve, shifting slowly as the sun descends. You feel him in the curve of a hand resting on a blanket, its veins rising like rivers beneath skin, pulsing with the quiet rhythm of blood that he once traced by candlelight, wondering how such a small thing could sustain an entire existence. You feel him in the way steam curls from a cup and vanishes into air, tracing shapes no one will ever capture, spirals that form and dissolve like thoughts arising and fading in the mind. These are the moments where he lives, not because you name him, not because you recall his paintings or recite dates, but because you slow down, because you choose to notice, because you allow yourself to wonder why things move the way they do, why water spirals when it drains, why shadows lengthen earlier each day, why a smile can hold so much and say so little. There is no need to call his name. There's no need to prove you remember. You honor him simply by being present, by letting your gaze linger, by refusing to rush, by understanding that to truly see is not to glance, but to stay, to return, to feel the weight of a single leaf, the pulse behind a heartbeat, the silence between breaths, the invisible thread connecting all things. He lives in every artist who paints not for fame, not for applause, not to fill galleries with admirers, but for truth, who mixes colors until they breathe, till they carry the warmth of sunlight or the chill of shadow, who studies a face not for likeness, but for what lives behind the eyes, for the memory hidden in a wrinkle, for the sorrow that rests in the corner of a mouth. He lives in every scientist who dissects not to conquer, not to control, but to understand. who traces the path of blood through the heart with reverence, who believes that nature speaks in patterns only revealed to those who look long enough, who listen not with instruments alone, but with patience, with humility, with love. He lives in every inventor who sketches a machine that cannot yet be built, not because they expect it to work tomorrow, not because they crave recognition, but because they trust that someone, someday, will pick up the idea and carry it further, that a drawing of wings, shaped like a bat's, might one day lift a man into the sky, that a design for a bridge without supports might inspire a new way of building. He lives in every teacher who tells a student, look again, not to correct, not to scold, but to deepen, to awaken, to invite them into the same endless search he walked for 80 years, guided not by answers, by questions, too beautiful to let go, too profound to ever finish. And he lives in you not because you know his story, not because you've seen his paintings or read his notes, translated into modern language, but because you are capable of wonder, because you, too, have paused to watch rain fall on a window pane, tracing the paths of droplets as they split and rejoin, curious about the forces that pull them together or tear them apart, because you felt the warmth of sunlight on your skin and wondered how it traveled millions of miles through empty space to reach you, how it carries energy born in fire, how it touches everything equally, whether stone or soul, because you've held a loved one's hand and sensed the life moving beneath the surface, the pulse, the heat, the delicate balance of bones and tendons working together to make a simple gesture possible. These are not small things. They are the very essence of what he spent a lifetime exploring. You do not need to build flying machines or paint masterpieces to carry his legacy. You only need to remain open to let your attention rest on what is real, to resist the urge to fill silence with noise, to believe that even the smallest observation is an act of love, that to care deeply about a single thing, a leaf, a shadow, a breath, is to touch the infinite, to participate in the same quiet devotion he lived. His notebooks scattered across libraries in London, Madrid, Paris, Turin, still whispered to those who approached them with patience, with clean hands, with a mind ready to receive rather than take. The pages are fragile, their edges worn from centuries of turning, the ink faded in places, the mirror script curling backward like a secret meant to unfold slowly, only for those willing to read from right to left, to reverse their thinking, to enter his mind not as a visitor, but as a companion. And yet when you sit before one, when you trace the delicate lines of a bat's wing, the spiral of water around a stone, the cross-section of a human skull, rendered with such precision, it seems you could hear the brain inside, feel it. Not awe, not admiration, not the thrill of discovery, but kinship. As if you are not reading history, but conversing with a mind that never stopped seeking, that believed the world was not something to be mastered, but to be understood, cherished, returned to again and again, studied not to possess, but to honor. There is no urgency in the drawings, no demand for completion. Only the quiet certainty that to draw is to learn, that to study is to honor, that to ask is to live more deeply, more fully, more gently. Even his unfinished works speak louder than most finished ones, the adoration of the Magi left in motion, horses turning mid-step, figures reacting with shock and awe, light falling across chaos like a divine interruption. Saint Jerome, his hand raised mid-gesture, as if about to speak, to warn, to pray. The Battle of Anghiari, lost to time, remembered only in copies made by those who stood before it in wonder, its energy still palpable in the swirl of pigment and fury. These are not failures. They are invitations. Spaces where the viewer steps in, completes the thought, feels the tension, carries the emotion forward. In their incompleteness, they teach us that life is not about finishing, but about feeling, that meaning often lives in the middle, in the becoming, in the breath before the word is spoken, in the hand that never quite reaches its destination. And perhaps that is why they endure, because they do not claim to have answers, but instead reflect the truth of being human, that we are all unfinished, all becoming, all searching, all carrying questions we may never solve, and that there is beauty in the search itself, in the willingness to remain open, to keep going, to keep seeing. The Mona Lisa still watches from her room in Paris, not with pride, not with mystery for its own sake, not as a trophy behind glass, but with quiet knowing, the presence so deep it transcends paint and panel. She does not smile because she is happy, nor because she hides a secret, but because she exists in that rare space between thought and feeling, where joy and sorrow, memory and presence coexist without conflict, where time itself seems to pause. Generations have stood before her, trying to explain her, to decode her, to measure her smile with mathematics or psychology, to claim her for France, for Italy, for art history, and yet she remains untouched by their theories. She simply is. And in that stillness, she teaches the same lesson Leonardo lived, that depth is not found in noise, but in silence, that understanding comes not from rushing, but from staying, from returning, from allowing oneself to be seen as much as to see. She is not a woman, she is a mirror. And in her gaze, we find ourselves. And so, his echo is not loud, does not announce itself with trumpets or headlines. It is in the way a painter blends shadow into light so softly it seems to breathe. In the way an engineer studies airflow not just for function, but for beauty. In the way a child asks, why? Without fear of sounding foolish, without shame, without knowing that in that single word, they are walking the same path he walked. It is in the decision to keep going, even when no one sees, even when the world demands speed, efficiency, productivity. Even when doubt whispers that nothing lasts, that effort is wasted, that curiosity leads nowhere. He did not leave behind a kingdom, a dynasty, a doctrine carved in stone. He left behind a way of being curious, patient, tender, relentless in the pursuit of truth, gentle in its expression. And because of that, he is not confined to the past. He walks beside anyone, anywhere, who chooses to see the world not as it appears, but as it might be understood, who believes that to look closely is to love deeply, and that love in all its forms is the only thing that truly outlives us. As you listen now, resting in your own quiet space, wrapped in warmth, breathing slowly, letting your thoughts soften like ink dissolving in water, know that you are not separate from this echo. You are part of it. Your stillness matters. Your attention matters. Your capacity to wonder, to feel, to care, these are not small things. They are the very fabric of a life well lived, the quiet legacy of a man who taught us that to look closely is to love deeply. And that love, in all its forms, is the only thing that truly outlives us. You do not need to change the world. You only need to remain open, to let the light fall where it may, to trust that even the smallest act of seeing, of listening, of staying present, sends ripples forward into a future you will never see. But that will carry your light all the same, not because you shouted, but because you stayed, because you looked, because you love the world enough to wonder about it deeply, quietly, endlessly. Let us breathe together. Let the story continue. And so, we come to the end of this quiet journey, not with a final word, but with a long breath, like the last ripple fading on a still pond, like the final note of a lullaby lingering in the air after the voice has gone silent. You've walked beside a man who lived centuries ago, not through dates or battles, not through triumphs carved in stone, but through his eyes, through his hands, through the way he paused to wonder at a leaf, a shadow, a smile. And perhaps in listening you have not only remembered him, but met him not as a distant figure in history, but as a presence in this moment, here with you now. In the soft weight of the blanket, in the rise and fall of your breath, in the silence between thoughts. Thank you for staying with me tonight. Thank you for closing your eyes, for letting go of the day, for making space in your heart and mind, for a story told slowly, gently, like candlelight moving across a wall. If you'd like to share where in time or space you're listening from, whether beneath a window lit by moonlight, wrapped in warmth on a quiet evening, or drifting between wakefulness and dreams, know that you are not alone. Thousands of others are here with you, resting in this same stillness, letting the past cradle them as they prepare for sleep. Your presence matters. Your attention matters. And simply by being here, by choosing to listen deeply, you have honored not just this story, but the quiet courage it takes to remain open in a world that often asks us to rush. Let yourself rest now. Let your body sink into stillness, as if the earth itself were holding you, supporting every part of you without demand or expectation. There's nothing more to do, nothing left to finish. No need to remember every word, every image, every name. They were not given to burden you, but to guide you here, to this moment of peace, to this breath, to this soft surrender. Like Leonardo, who spent a lifetime asking questions without needing answers, you do not need to understand everything to belong to this peace. You only need to be here, exactly as you are. Let the echoes of his life continue to whisper in your awareness, not as history, but as feeling, in the way light falls across your room, in the curve of your own hand resting gently against the fabric, in the quiet pulse beneath your wrist, steady, unseen, alive. These are not small things. They are the very threads he spent a lifetime tracing, the invisible patterns that connect all living things. And though he is gone, his way of seeing remains, not in museums, not in books, but in the simple act of noticing, caring, of staying with something long enough to love it. So let yourself drift now, not away from this moment, but deeper into it. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften, like ink dissolving in water. Let your mind wander, not toward tomorrow, not toward yesterday, but into dreams perhaps of quiet hills in Tuscany, of notebooks filled with wings, of rivers that spiral like stars, of a smile that knows your name. There is no hurry, no destination, only this breath, this stillness, this kindness. And when you're ready, not tonight, not tomorrow, but whenever the quiet calls again, we'll meet once more, beneath another sky, in another time, for another story told softly, just for you. Until then, sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle.